welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the world of Christopher Columbus,
Oh, excellent choice.
a figure who's sparked, I think, endless debate and continues to fascinate us even after all these centuries.
Yes, absolutely. And you've given us some really incredible sources to work with. We've got firsthand accounts, historical analyses, even some details that really challenge the traditional narrative.
Yes.
Get ready to see Columbus in a whole new light.
I'm already intrigued. So where do we even begin with a figure as complex as Columbus?
Right.
The sources paint a picture of him as ambitious from a young age, setting sail for the first time at just 14.
Wow. Yeah, that's...
Practically unheard of,
He
right?
really is. When you consider that context, it starts to make sense why he possessed such a strong sense of adventure and resilience.
Right.
These traits are evident throughout his entire story, driving him to push boundaries and take risks that most wouldn't even dream of.
That makes sense. But what about the voyages themselves? I always thought his main goal was proving that the Earth was round.
Right.
But the sources suggest there was much more to it than that.
Yeah, it's a common misconception.
Go ahead.
Most educated Europeans in the 15th century already accepted that the Earth was spherical.
Oh, okay.
Columbus was actually aiming for something far more ambitious, a faster westward route to the riches of the East Indies, places like China and India.
So cutting out the middleman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine the impact that would have had on trade and global power.
Wow, a quest for a shortcut.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there were those powerful personal motivations as well. I mean, the titles and riches promised to Columbus were extraordinary. Viceroy, admiral, a share of all the wealth found. It was a high-stakes gamble.
It was.
With the potential for immense rewards.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that exploration wasn't driven solely by these noble ideals.
Okay.
It was also a business venture fueled by ambition, competition, and the allure of wealth and power.
Right.
Columbus, like many others, was driven by a complex mix of motivations.
Okay, so we've got an ambitious explorer, a world hungry for riches and new trade routes. And that brings us to Voyage 1.
Okay.
90 men, 3 ships sailing into the vast unknown. It's easy to romanticize that image, but I imagine the reality was far more challenging.
Absolutely. While the image of those ships sailing off into the sunset is compelling, the reality was filled with hardship, risk, and constant uncertainty.
Yeah.
But amidst those challenges, we see incredible examples of skill and ingenuity.
Okay.
The sources highlight the crucial role of the Pinzon brothers,
Okay.
masters of navigation.
What?
Their expertise was just as vital to the success of the voyage as Columbus's vision.
That's an excellent point. This wasn't just blind luck. It was a combination of ambition, expertise, and perhaps a bit of daring that propelled them forward. And after 33 days at sea, imagine the collective sigh of release when they finally spotted land.
Can you imagine that feeling? To see land after weeks of nothing but open ocean?
I can't.
They named their first landing spot San Salvador, marking the beginning of their exploration of the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola.
And they even left 40 men behind at a fort called La Navidad, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences.
Right?
It must have been an incredible mix of excitement and fear for those left behind, facing the unknown with limited resources and communication.
It makes you wonder about their thoughts, their hopes, and their fears as they watch the ships sail away. And speaking of potential conflicts, our sources mention the wrecking of the Santa Maria and the Pinzon brothers taking a side trip in search of gold. These incidents hint at tensions and differing priorities within the crew, a theme that would become increasingly important as the voyages continued.
That's a really interesting detail.
Yeah.
So even from the beginning, there were cracks in the facade of this unified expedition. It seems like those individual desires for wealth and personal gain were already starting to create friction.
Exactly, and these conflicts, fueled by the inherent risks and uncertainties of exploration, would eventually boil over and shape the course of events in ways that Columbus likely never anticipated. It's fascinating how these early tensions and competing priorities foreshadow the larger challenges that Columbus would face, and those challenges become even more apparent when we look at his second voyage.
Oh, absolutely. The scale of the second voyage was dramatically different. We're talking 17 ships and over 1,200 men. This wasn't just about exploring anymore. It was about establishing a permanent presence, a colony. What a dramatic shift.
It really highlights the growing ambitions of Spain. They recognized the potential wealth and power that this new world represented, not just for trade, but for spreading their influence and religion.
So it's less about discovering at this point and more about claiming and exploiting. And Columbus didn't waste any time exploring new territories. This time he visited Dominica, Marie Galante, Guadeloupe. He even named Dominica after the day of the week he landed there. It's like he was creating a whole new world in his own image.
It's amazing how these names, chosen often on a whim, have endured for centuries. But beneath this flurry of exploration and expansion, there's a dark undercurrent that starts to emerge. Remember that Fort La Navidad where Columbus left 40 men behind on his first voyage?
Yes, what happened there? It seemed like such a risky move even back then.
Well, imagine returning to find the fort burned to the ground with no survivors. The sources suggest a clash with the native Taino people, a stark reminder that this new world was already inhabited and its people were not simply going to step aside.
That's a chilling discovery, and it makes you wonder how this event might have shaped Columbus's actions going forward. The sources paint a disturbing picture of the second voyage, including the massacre of Tainos and the enslavement of Caribs. Even Queen Isabella back in Spain was angered by his brutality. It seems like the cracks we saw earlier were becoming full-blown fissures.
It's a tragic example of how quickly things can unravel when different cultures clash, especially when fueled by greed and the pursuit of power. Columbus's actions had devastating consequences for the indigenous populations he encountered, shattering the myth of peaceful exploration and revealing the brutal reality of colonization.
And it wasn't just conflict with the indigenous populations, there was unrest among the Spanish settlers themselves, vying for power and control, and even the Taino uprising. The dream of a harmonious and profitable colony was quickly dissolving into chaos.
It's a stark reminder that human nature, with its complexities and often conflicting desires, plays a huge role in shaping the course of history, even with grand visions. And the best intentions, the reality on the ground can be very different.
So with all this turmoil and violence, what happens next in Columbus's story? Do things improve at all on his third and fourth voyages, or is it a continued downward spiral?
Well, from what I'm gathering from these sources, the third and fourth voyages weren't exactly smooth sailing either. Yeah, you're right. They were actually marked by a series of setbacks, and ultimately the failure to achieve his original goal of reaching the East on his third voyage, Columbus, did make a significant discovery, the mainland of South America.
That's huge. You'd think that would have been a triumphant moment.
You'd think so, right? But he didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he had found. He was still so fixated on reaching the East Indies, and meanwhile, back on Hispaniola, the colony he'd established was descending further into chaos and mismanagement.
It sounds like his ambitions and the realities he faced were on a collision course.
Exactly. The unrest and complaints about his leadership, which had been simmering since the earlier voyages, finally reached a boiling point. He was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains.
Wow, imagine that the man who discovered a new world brought home in disgrace. What a dramatic turn of events.
It really is. It makes you think about how history remembers its heroes and villains.
So what about that fourth voyage? Was he trying to redeem himself?
In a way, yes. He was still convinced he could find a westward passage to Asia. But this final voyage was plagued by hardship storms, diseased shipworms, eating away at his vessels. It seems almost symbolic of his fading fortunes.
And he never did find that passage to the east, did he?
No, he didn't. He explored parts of Central America, desperately searching for a route through, but it was not meant to be. Columbus died a few years later, largely forgotten, despite the profound and lasting impact of his voyages.
It's a complex legacy, isn't it? On one hand, he opened up the Americas to Europe, sparking an era of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. But on the other hand, his voyages led to the exploitation and suffering of indigenous populations, setting in motion centuries of colonization and its devastating consequences.
It really challenges us to think about how we view historical figures. Columbus was neither a saint nor a monster, but a product of his time driven by a complex mix of motivations, ambition, curiosity, greed, and a fervent belief in his own destiny.
I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not about passing judgment on Columbus, but understanding the complexities of his actions and the far-reaching ripple effects of his voyages.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, how might history have unfolded differently if Columbus had never set sail? Would another explorer have eventually made those same discoveries? Would the encounter between Europe and the Americas have been less violent and exploitative?
That's a question we can only ponder. But one thing's for certain, the world we live in today is inextricably linked to the voyages of Christopher Columbus. His story is a reminder that even the most ambitious dreams can have unintended, often tragic consequences.
And it's a story that continues to resonate today as we grapple with the legacies of colonialism and strive to build a more just and equitable world.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Christopher Columbus.